Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 1 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vegas Golden Knights, in which the Sharks have lost 4-1. It has been many months since we have seen an NHL regular season game played by the San Jose Sharks. There have been tons of changes that have gone to the roster. Multiple new faces littered the lineup here tonight. More than half of this roster has less than 25 games with the organization prior to tonight's game. And so, while many things have changed, a lot of things still ended up remaining the same, as this was a very much San Jose Sharks 22-23 type of game. It was one that was decently close until it wasn't, and at the end of the day, it ended up being one that doesn't really look all that great on the score sheet. So this one starts off in the first period. It is a relatively even game, while the Golden Knights are getting the majority of the zone time, something that is to be expected with the Sharks' new type of lineup that they have this season. They aren't getting a ton of great chances, and it actually ends up being a 1-1 tie at the end of 20 minutes, including Filip Zadina's first career goal as a San Jose Shark in his first career game as a San Jose Shark. So for sure, good for him. In the second period, things actually picked up a bit for San Jose, getting a few more chances on net. Nothing super dangerous, but to be fair, the Zadina shot wasn't particularly dangerous either, and yet still managed to go in. So it's not as though the Sharks were doing anything terribly in that second period, at least until the last few minutes, where these last three shifts of this game were just absolutely awful for the San Jose Sharks. They give up a goal to Haig, then they give up a goal to Wah, and then they almost give up yet another goal. 3 straight it would have been for the Golden Knights. Luckily for them, they managed to hold that one off, at least for the time being, and yet they still find themselves in a 2-goal hole because of that absolute disastrous last couple of minutes going into the third period. And yet, the Golden Knights end up making up for their missed chance at the end of the second with an early goal in the third, a first career goal, mind you, for Pakal here. And then it ends up being a 4-1 loss for San Jose, who in the third period, they get a couple of okay chances, but nothing beating Logan Thompson. And so the expectation coming into this season was very low, and the expectation coming into this particular game against the defending Stanley Cup champions were extremely low, and it seemed as though those people were correct, at least for the time being, with this 4-1 loss. Moving on to the lineup, this is exactly what the San Jose Sharks have been running in practice, at least when it comes to their forward lineup, so not really any surprises here, except perhaps on the fourth line, which we'll get to a bit later. But let us start off immediately with the first line of Hertl, Zadina, and Hoffman. And I want to talk about Hertl for sure. Coming into this season, I talked about how Hertl had been pretty disappointing over these past couple of years. I had given him some excuses of a contract year, and it's difficult to come in with any hope when the team seems really down and out of it, yada, yada, yada. But this season, there was a lot of excitement around this team, not in terms of we're going to make the playoffs, but in terms of there are new faces, there are new players, and it was expected, especially with Logan Couture out of the lineup, that Tomas Hertl could be some sort of leader for all of these new faces. As I mentioned, 11 players iced here tonight for the San Jose Sharks who haven't played more than 25 games for the organization. And so I was for sure looking to Hertl to actually be perhaps the Sharks' best forward on the night, and that just did not happen, not even particularly close. Hertl probably had about 2 solid shifts in this game, one in the first period, and then there was one in the third period. Maybe there's one that I'm missing elsewhere, but for a player who is making over $8 million, you absolutely need to be better than that, and yet it still seems to be a lot of the same from Tomas Hertl from what we saw last year and in the past couple of years even. So definitely rather disappointing start for him. And while I talked about in the preseason him not exactly looking great, I always gave that excuse of, well, it's the preseason, but perhaps the preseason is more indicative than we may have thought. Even though those games are relatively meaningless, you do still want to use them to warm up your game, and Hertl did not do that in the preseason, and he's come out rather cold here in the regular season. However, he was joined on his wing by Mike Hoffman, who had a pretty solid regular season, though was very disappointing here tonight as well. I had originally thought that Hoffman should move down in the lineup, would fit a bit better in the third line position to face off against weaker competition. Instead, David Quinn leaves him on the top line with Tomas Hertl, and it just doesn't work particularly well. Hoffman practically invisible here tonight. The good news is that he was not as much of a defensive liability as I thought he may be in this particular role, but he wasn't doing anything offensively, which is really what you have Hoffman on a team for, so that was still rather sad to see. However, the final player on this line, Filip Zadina, was the direct opposite of his two line mates. Zadina, on the other hand, actually had a really solid game. Zadina had been a very middling forward through the preseason for the San Jose Sharks, a player who I didn't even think necessarily belonged much on the first line because he really didn't show much more than like a 5-on-10 performance throughout most of his preseason games. And yet here tonight was definitely his best outing in a San Jose Sharks uniform, played a very solid game, scored a goal here, and was perhaps even the Sharks' best forward on the night, for sure in the top 3. When it comes to this second line of Eklund, Granlund, and Kunin, I definitely also had some excitement here. Granlund played a very strong one preseason game with the San Jose Sharks. Eklund had multiple preseason games, all looking very good, and Kunin seemed to be a decent complement for this line, but it didn't really go particularly well here tonight at all. Granlund was an absolute disaster, perhaps one of the worst forwards for the San Jose Sharks, definitely in the bottom 3 in contrast to what I said about Filip Zadina. Granlund did not end up playing the last few minutes of this game, I believe due to sort of injury precaution. I don't think it was an active benching, but honestly, if I'm David Quinn, I wouldn't have even blamed him for benching Granlund in that situation because he was very bad, so that was definitely disappointing to see. William Eklund I thought was pretty good, certainly had a few solid shifts, but certainly not at the level that I was hoping him to be and what I had been seeing from him through the preseason. To put another rating into this one, it probably like a 5-on-10, maybe 6-on-10 performance from William Eklund. And then Luke Kunin, I thought Kunin continued to do exactly his role on this line, exactly what we had seen from him in the final preseason game of the year in which he was still with Granlund and Eklund. He puts himself in decent positions to score goals. He gets good shots away. It was early in this first period. He was probably the only player actually getting great chances on net in that first period besides the Filip Zadina goal. But at the end of the day, it didn't really amount to anything. And when Kunin isn't in those goal-scoring positions, he's not exactly doing a ton to really help out this line. So in general, a pretty weak second line outing. When it comes to the third line, speaking of weak outings, we have Duclair, Bordeleau, and Barabanov. And I do want to start with Anthony Duclair, who had also a pretty disappointing preseason. I've mentioned that multiple times, and I was hoping that outside of the preseason he could do better because these games are more meaningful. And yet, like with Mikael Granlund, he was practically invisible here tonight. Maybe he had like one good shift where he had a very nice pass to Bordeleau. I believe that was at a point in the second period. And yet, besides that, Duclair doing very, very little in a third line role. This is a player who is expected to be a top 6 player in the NHL. The Sharks are hoping that he can be that so that they can move him at the deadline for top 6 value, and yet even in a third line role can't really accomplish much offensively. And this isn't necessarily anything to do with his line mates because they're pretty good. You know, Bordeleau somewhat inexperienced, but his winger on the other side, Barabanov, is a 50-point point scorer at the NHL level. So there really are no excuses here for Duclair, who just didn't do anything in this game. On the other side, I do mention Barabanov, who was similarly very invisible here tonight. Just two very disappointing performances for the two wingers of this line. When it comes to Thomas Bordeleau, not exactly doing a ton offensively, though his wingers weren't really helping him out. A criticism that I had very much, pretty much echoing from that last preseason game of the season. But one thing that I do want to mention on the positive side of things for Thomas Bordeleau is something that was definitely noticeable in the preseason, is that he wasn't exactly doing very well along the boards. And as a centerman, you are going to be engaging in a lot of puck battles, and Bordeleau seemed hesitant at times to do that. And in the puck battles that he did get into, he was losing them more often than not. But that was a bit different here tonight. He was definitely much more willing to lay the body onto some Golden Knights players, and he was actually more often than not coming out on top in terms of those puck battles. Now, his defensive zone positioning did leave a bit to be desired, as we saw on the Golden Knights' first goal of this game. As Henry Thrun goes for an aggressive chase on against William Karlsson behind the net, Bordeleau seems to be lost in what he needs to do to make up for Thrun's play. play there, and so he isn't tagging Amadio in this situation, which leads to this goal. So definitely a bit of issues there, but Bordalot's board play was rather impressive, and so I thought he actually had a pretty decent night tonight. And then finally we get to the fourth line. While the first three lines were pretty disappointing in the majority of the night, I would say, for the San Jose Sharks, the fourth line was actually quite solid. This is where the only controversy, I guess, happened for the Sharks lineup, as there was a decision going into tonight of whether or not Zetterlund or Labanc would be the 12th forward or the 13th forward, and in the end David Quinn goes for Fabian Zetterlund, which is of course no real surprise. I personally would have put Labanc in because I don't exactly like Zetterlund as a player, considering he has done literally nothing with the San Jose Sharks since arriving here from New Jersey. But as we know, David Quinn is not a huge fan of Kevin Labanc, and I can understand for sure the logic of putting Zetterlund here. Both Smith and Sturm are very gritty type of players, big-bodied type of players, and Zetterlund fits in very well in that regard, being three big-bodied types of players, while Labanc play style, I guess you could say, clashes a bit with the other two players on this line. So I guess you could say it makes more sense to have Zetterlund here, and it ends up being a smart decision from Quinn because Zetterlund played perhaps his best game as a San Jose Shark. That's not saying much. I don't think Zetterlund was fantastic here tonight, but definitely better than what we have seen from him in the past. Sturm looked quite good, and Givani Smith also continued his strong preseason play into the regular season, looking quite good and made up the best line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. But of course, as I've mentioned many times last season, if your fourth line is your best line of the night, things aren't necessarily going to be going well for you on, a consistent basis, because usually your fourth line is supposed to be that line that's getting like 10 minutes a night, not the one that's leading the charge offensively. Once we move on to defensively, this is where there were some changes over practice. As I mentioned in my season preview, it honestly is not really a lineup that's ever going to be set in stone. Besides Mario Ferraro finding himself on the first defensive pairing, I expect many substitutions elsewhere, jumping from first to third to second pairings all the time. But in the end, they settle on Ferraro and Burrows as the top pairing for the San Jose Shark. But I use the term top pairing very, very sparingly here because of the fact that they weren't really treated as such. In fact, the ice time between all six defensemen was exceptionally close. The sixth highest ice time in terms of defensemen, so the least ice time in terms of defensemen, was only about 3 or so minutes lower than the highest ice time, which was of course Mario Ferraro. So I was somewhat expecting Ferraro to be leading with like 22, 23 minutes, but he gets about 20 and a half here tonight. And I mentioned how Ferraro is likely going to be leaned on as the number one guy for the San Jose Sharks, and that he was going to have to show up in that regard after what was an extremely bad season for him last year. And I thought this was a great start for the season for Mario Ferraro. Definitely the Sharks' best defenseman on the night. Looked pretty good in the defensive zone. Now, obviously, I will say the issues of being able to clear the puck out and getting hemmed in their own zone, it exists. It's an issue for the San Jose Sharks that they're going to deal with over an 82-game season. There really aren't any easy solves in this regard because they don't really have the skill to make this an easy solve. But when it was in the defensive zone, Ferraro was doing a pretty good job, much better than what could be said about him last year. And his partner, Kyle Burrows, I thought Burrows had a bit of a slow start. His first couple of shifts were quite bad in the first period, but as the game went on, he certainly picked it up and ended up looking relatively solid. When it comes to the second line, I was a bit surprised to see Benning not on the first pairing, but perhaps Quinn wanted to retain the already known chemistry of Vlasic and Benning, and so they end up making up a decent defensive pairing. Not great, not terrible. I thought Benning was okay. I thought Vlasic was a bit worse than okay, but not maybe as awful as you would expect from Marc-Edouard Vlasic. So I guess that's a slight positive in itself. But then when we get to the third pairing, we perhaps have the most disappointing player of the game in my eyes. I've already mentioned Duclair, Granlund, Hoffman. These players definitely had disappointing nights, but Henry Thrun was someone who I had high hopes for, and here tonight was perhaps his worst game as a San Jose Shark, in my opinion. Just not looking on it at all. There were issues sort of advertised with Henry Thrun. One of the reasons he ended up being a later round pick in the third round with the Anaheim Ducks a few years ago was that his skating wasn't necessarily all that great, but you can make up for sort of mid skating if you have strong positioning. And that was something we had seen from Thrun at the end of the season last year in his short stint of games with the San Jose Sharks. While his skating wasn't outstanding, his positioning was very solid, and funnily enough, he actually made his NHL debut against the Vegas Golden Knights, which still stands as perhaps his best game with the San Jose Sharks. And so seeing him in his season debut this year just get absolutely victimized time and time again was very, very disappointing. It seemed as though the Golden Knights were specifically targeting him in the defensive zone and just absolutely racing by him along the boards, as he just couldn't seem to keep up transitioning from skating backwards to skating forwards after these Golden Knights players. This happened like 3 or 4 times in this game. And then on top of that, multiple very, very bad defensive zone giveaways as well in the latter half of this one, which just were extremely ugly to watch. And so I thought Thrun had an okay start to this game. The first 20 minutes, first 30 minutes were pretty decent for him, but as the game wore on, really, really bad finish, and hopefully that's something that he can pick up if he's even given the opportunity to do so, as we know, there are multiple defensemen waiting in the wings for the San Jose Sharks, in particular Nikolai Knyzhov. That could be a substitution we see going into the next game. But that will do it, or no, I shouldn't mention actually the goaltender here tonight. Cannot forget Kaapo Kähkönen before we end this review. Kähkönen, I had hopes coming into this season. He had a decently strong couple outings in the preseason, both games against the Golden Knights, interestingly enough, but we saw what happened now here against an actual full-powered, full-roster Golden Knights. You know, it was a good start to this one. Definitely have zero blame for him on the Amadio goal, but the Hague one was terrible. The Pakal one in the third period was terrible. The Roy one was not terrible, but not great either, and this was just generally a bad game for Kähkönen. And so game 1, you're not exactly inspiring a lot of hope with this performance. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will go up from facing off against the defending Stanley Cup champions tonight to facing off against the defending Stanley Cup champions from 2 years ago, the Colorado Avalanche. So the schedule does not get any easier for the San Jose Sharks. We'll see what happens. Class dismissed.